Order, order. This is the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. This is our second panel into our inquiry into racism and Yorkshire cricket. We're joined here by the former chair, Roger Hutton, who has very bravely and kindly actually answered the call to come in and wanted to come in. We do note as a committee that Mr Arthurs and Mr Moxon were both invited, and they have both chosen not to attend, despite being there for longer and by all accounts having much more of an impact in terms of the mishandling of Mr Rafiq's case. First of all, you've been sat in the room throughout this, Mr Hutton. What do you make of what you've heard from Mr Rafiq?
Azim was incredibly powerful. That's what he spoke brilliantly, and it just makes you desperately sad for what he's gone through. I have apologised on a couple of occasions, but I would repeat my profound apology for the experiences he's had with the club, and he's been phenomenally brave. I thought he was very articulate today, and I think he's done an outstanding job today.
And what are your views of the fact that Mr Arthurs and Mr Moxon have chosen not to attend, and what are your views in terms of the way in which they have handled this inquiry?
I'm deeply disappointed they're not here today. I'm deeply disappointed that essentially Azim's allegations, and there are a number, stem from 2007 to 2018. I volunteered to be chairman in April 2020, 18 months after he'd left, and I would have thought it would have been right for the club to have representatives today from people who were there while Azim was employed and had a direct relationship with him. I've literally never met Azim until this morning. And I would have also thought it would have been good for the club to have someone who was currently representative of themselves this morning. So,
are they cowards?
I think the answer is for the two executives, they found this whole process very difficult. They have failed, in my view, to accept the gravity of the situation. They have not wanted to apologise, and they have not wanted to take the recommendations of the panel going forward. Azim made a very powerful point this morning about this being an opportunity for the club to change. And at the very, very start, when the investigation took place, that's what I and the non-executives thought this would be. But sadly, it's turned out to be the reverse.
At what stage did you know that was going to happen, that effectively that the permanent directors on the board were going to effectively blockade any attempts to move the club forwards?
There were a number of signals throughout this process. There was a moment when I was asked if we could abandon the investigation. One of the executives.
Sorry, who asked you to abandon the investigation and when?
The CEO asked whether we could abandon the investigation. In June 2020 of this year, or 2021 this year, there was an employment tribunal, and the non-executives and I were very anxious that, for good reason, that employment tribunal was settled, essentially because the club at a minimum knew that it had done some things that were wrong. And at that stage, the CEO made it clear that he would not and did not want to apologise to Azim Rafiq.
Right. So it's personal.
I cannot say that. That's what he told me. At an early stage, I suggested that, as in fact one of the members did this morning, that Azim Rafiq may well be part of the process of healing and reconciliation and help with the driving the positive agenda going forward. And I was told that he wouldn't be welcome. So there were these isolated moments throughout the course of that investigation. The biggest issues came to my light after the report was produced in 17th of August of this year and beyond, when there was a clear resistance to see Azim as the victim, a clear resistance to apologise, and as worryingly, a failure to look at the recommendations the panel had put forward and start executing them. So this would not happen again in the future.
Okay. So the 17th of August, that's when you became aware that effectively they wanted to sit on the report.
Well, there's not one defining moment. You're in a board and you're hoping to create change from within. But yes, I saw resistance, and the resistance accumulated.
Do you regret the fact that you didn't resign early? I mean, you obviously resigned obviously once this has come out. I know the fact that you contacted the committee to express the fact that you actually wanted to come here as chair and then resign. That circumstances didn't allow that. But you'd seen from Essex, for instance, where the N-word was used by one of the board members, and that case has come forward, and then Mr. Stevenson, the chair, then said that if this is not dealt with and apologised for, I resign. Simple as that. Why didn't you take a similar action?
Well, I believed that the club's culture was stuck in the past. I think the club's culture needs changing. I didn't see that my resigning would be the way of changing that culture in August. I thought that my best way of changing it was trying to change it from within, until it became apparent that I was no longer able to do that.
Do you regret that choice now? Because clearly, just as an outside observer, if you had said in August, well, I tell you, this is absolutely out of order, you dinosaurs are holding this process up, and frankly, we need to put this out in the public domain, we need to apologise, we need to move forward, and we need to basically understand where the problem is. Do you regret the fact that you didn't, at that point, make a stand?
I don't actually. It would have been easier for me personally had I done so, and I wouldn't be being criticised for not having left earlier. But no, I believe trying to continue to make the change actually has made this more of an issue.
You mean by not just obviously
by not capitulating
by screwing up to such an extent it's made it such an issue?
No, by not capitulating to those people who didn't want change to happen and to use this as an opportunity to move forward.
So you saw resigning at that point as capitulation rather than making a stand?
Yes.
Okay. The role of the previous chair in all this, as I understand it, he was making a bid to take back over control. I think I've heard the phrase take back control before, and he wanted to take back over effectively from his position. So what is your sort of view of his part in all this?
You referring to Mr. Graves? So one of my difficulties as chair is that I can't remove a director from the board without the consent of the Colin Graves Trust. And I spoke to those trustees on personal occasions and on a couple of meetings, and it was made clear to me that they were supportive of the people in the club that I felt were partly to blame for the negative.
Which people? Which people?
Some of the senior management.
So Arthurs and Moxon were supported by the Colin Graves Trust?
Yes.
Okay.
And some of the senior management, the head of HR.
Okay. So, as well as you wanted to remove HR? Is that fair?
So I believe that there are a number of people in the organisation who ultimately affect the culture negatively.
Right, okay. Not quite clear enough there, I'm afraid, Mr. Hutton.
Okay.
Who did you want to remove? And who, precisely, and what did the Colin Graves Trust say to you?
Okay, so I would have liked to remove Mark Arthur and ultimately Martin Moxon, not because of the conduct that is referred to in the report, but actually as a consequence of their failure to understand the gravity of the situation, the failure to apologise, and particularly for their failure to move on the recommendations that the panel had put forward. So for me, I would like to have removed those two people. It would never. I'm not an executive chairman. I also thought that actually the head of HR should also be removed.
Yeah, but they were individuals who sat on a bus hearing one of their players referred to as a P. And then they did nothing about it. Surely that would be. I mean, frankly, I'd be staggered that if that was a situation that came to light when I was chair, that I wouldn't want to remove them for that reason, as well as them not understanding the PR around this whole shambles.
I can only describe to you the reasons why I thought they should be removed from the club, because essentially they didn't realise the gravity of the situation. the changes that should be made, and that Azim was a victim.
I'm interested in the Collingrave Trust. Basically, they have the money, because Yorkshire doesn't have any money, and Collingrave must have the money because of the big loan that was put in place. So basically, they're the money people. What they say goes. We have that bell for a moment. It does end, hopefully, in a second. There we go, as if by magic. But the Collingrave Trust, is this a pernicious element within Yorkshire? Because they have the keys to the castle, they've got the money. Yorkshire can't survive without the money from the Collingrave Trust, and yet here they are, as a trust, preventing you as a new chair, moving out, frankly, Moxon, Arthur, and the HR directors, who are people who, frankly, are bound to rights as far as this goes.
The club owes a substantial amount to the Collingrave Trust. I've not been involved in the history of the club. I imagine without that investment the club would have been in terrible difficulties, and historically the club would be indebted to the Collingrave Trust. I do think, on balance, it is wrong that a major creditor of that level has the keys to decisions that a board should or shouldn't make.
How does that change?
That's simply a negotiation between the club and the trust, or a refinancing of the debt.
Okay. Lord Patel, I can see you're in the audience today. Could you please step forward for us? Thank you. Thank you. I felt like a game show host there. Come on down, Lord Patel. But I'm sorry to bring you forward on this point. Okay. I know you can't talk about the investigation that's ongoing. We understand that as a committee. But Mr Hutton has just made a really interesting point here about the fact that the Collingrave Trust has effectively a veto blocking on any moves that you do in terms of the board. How do you change that? How do you get this, quite frankly, failing outlook, if you like, of the Collingrave Trust that has prevented Mr Hutton from dispensing with Mr Moxon and Mr Arthur? How do you get a grip on this?
I don't think for one second that I'd be sat there having gone through a proper process of any kind that's transparent and legal, for somebody to say to me, you can't do that, without giving me absolute concrete evidence on a legal basis or other why I can't as chair. And if that happened, I wouldn't accept it.
The option
and I would
is for you to
challenge
resign.
it.
That's the only option.
No, it's not for me to resign. It's to fight back and say.
I'm not asking you to resign.
No, no.
You just got that. But what I'm saying to you is that the only option, the only nuclear option you would have when you have the Collingrave Trust, which has a financial interest in Yorkshire, basically holds the board in the palm of its hand. That seems to be a desperately unhealthy relationship.
Look, so I've only met one of the trustees on Zoom a couple of times. I've found the person to be very receptive, very reasonable, very understanding. That's just my experience of 2 Zoom meetings. My understanding is she, along with the other trustee, would be held to account for, maybe to a child that's not even been born in the trust, to say, you made a decision in 2021 which affected my finances 50 years on, and she can be personally sued. So I think they'll be very, very careful about the decisions they make. My position, if an individual is bringing the game or the club into dispute and the evidence is there, they go.
Would you have sacked Moxon and Arthur? Or would you have sacked the HR
if I was
director?
there at the time, and if the evidence was such, it's difficult for me to obviously look back in history, but it's not about Martin or Mark. It's anybody who's bringing that club into dispute in a way that has been clearly evident this morning. As chair, you have a responsibility, and I would have taken that responsibility. And just my initial 2 interactions with the person from the trust, they're completely independent. They're looking at the finances. They were looking at the way forward. They were making sure their the finances are well guarded and looked after, and I think that's really important.
We'll ask you to stay in place if that's okay, but we do appreciate, I think all members do, that you can't talk about the current inquiry. Just finally, before we move on to Damien, Roger, why is it that you didn't sack any of the players who were involved in this racism?
The short answer is that I had no executive authority or responsibility in my role. If you're specifically talking about Gary Balance, which is the obvious person that is named in the report for using the P word, I wasn't involved in the investigation or the disciplinary piece. You will have seen the rather complex and convoluted description of the actions he took and the legal opinion in the report by the panel. In fact, by the panel. So I need to be clear; it was by the panel who made that point, where they concluded he had not racially harassed.
They basically suggested that calling on someone a Zimba is the same as calling someone a P. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, frankly, that's such. I'll actually, genuinely, words fail me on that approach. Why didn't words fail you? Why didn't you just say, well, basically, this is an employee of ours. They've used the P word to another employee, and they seem to have done it persistently. They need to go. And need to go now.
Well, as I say, I didn't have any executive role in this, but the reality is, you've seen one set of advice. That the club also took advice from lawyers, a different set of lawyers, who said that whilst there was a clear education and training need for Gary Balance, there was not a cause to bring disciplinary action against
him. And was
him.
education and training put in place?
Yes or no? I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Your chair?
There are many recommendations.
Just to remind you, were chair at the time.
Yes, I was. But there were a host of recommendations, and I don't know to the extent that it has or hasn't been put in place as yet. I don't know.
I mean, there's some sort of latitude to be had with the fact that you would obviously put in place in April 2020. But if this comes across your desk as a player calling another player a P, and they say about education and training, if that's the route that is recommended by the lawyers, I do find it staggering that you didn't follow through on that. At least, did you talk to Mox and North? Basically, was it so toxic in the Yorkshire boardroom that this sort of thing wasn't discussed?
It wasn't so toxic. Actually, it was hard to get them to do any of the things that you wanted to do. So from the 17th of August right the way through until Anna resigned, there were a series of board meetings where we repeatedly asked the executive to take steps, hosts of emails and hosts of calls saying, please, can you do the following things? And they weren't done.
Okay. Damien Green?
Thank you. The fact that there is nobody from the executive, either past or present, here with us today, and what you're describing, that basically you've held board meetings and they just ignore you, and presumably there were other, if you like, forces of light on the board, makes me really worried about the future of Yorkshire Cricket Club. Is there anyone working there who is capable of actually grasping this nettle?
Well, I have to say a couple of things, and it's I only started my role in COVID times, and actually I've been to the club only a limited number of times. So when you see, by example, that letter signed by, in fact, it was about 13 people saying what they said in that letter, I actually haven't met most of those people. I literally wouldn't be able to recognise most of those people. So it's hard for me to evaluate the personalities of all the people there. But yeah, I mean, Lord Patel, I'm thrilled that he's there and has already started doing a great job. There are a couple of non-executives that have remained. The non-executives were very supportive of my position at the time. They can definitely bring change. I'm hopeful that change will be brought, but I think there are 2 or 3 things still for the club to do, and I think that they're really important. When I first started, I was concerned about the governance in the club, and actually I also created an independent investigation of the governance of the club. That was produced in June. There were some 40-odd recommendations that we needed to improve upon. I'm not clear that's been done. The culture is at the heart of the issue here for me. It's a culture that's stuck in the past, however you want to describe it. That's the most polite way you could describe it. That the CEO has resigned is fine, but that isn't going to change the culture of itself. And thirdly, there are an enormous number of really positive recommendations made by that panel that, as the date I've resigned, there was no strategy to develop, and they also need to develop. So I'm very hopeful and optimistic about the club, because actually I love it, despite what we're talking about today, that those things happen. But they do need to happen.
But one of the, and perhaps this is for Lord Patel, I mean, what we're hearing is that the chairman could be as well intentioned as possible, but actually it's really difficult to implement the decisions that clearly need to be taken. And I absolutely get the point. Changing the culture is not just a question of replacing the CEO. There is a huge stables to be cleaned out there. As chairman, do you feel you've got the power and authority to do that?
I suppose in all the roles I've had, I've been here before, and I think it's how you implement it. It's very difficult if you can't see people face to face, and Roger was right, it was in a pandemic. So I've begun every day to see individuals, and yes, this is about culture. There's no question about culture, and it's just not about Yorkshire, it's about other clubs, it's about cricket, it's a culture change. What I've seen is a combination of things. There's a combination, and I'm very early, days into my tenure, but just in terms of, feeling and talking to people, you see denial, absolutely. You see phenomenally hard-working people who, have given their lives to the club. You see people who are terrified, scared, they're in the headlights, mentally completely stressed for not just themselves but their families, their children. You see a lot of sadness, and I think we're all going to have to go on a journey to change that. I'm going to have to be very active chairman. I think I have to play a leadership role at the moment. We haven't got leadership there. I'm very lucky that somebody stood up to sort of help Paul Hudson to keep things going. But this is an organisation that's been hammered left, right, and centre, maybe for the right reasons. But there's individuals at the heart of it, and just like Azim, the hurt that he's gone through, there's some people going through hurt as well. But changes are going to have to be made, and it's not going to be overnight, but by golly, we've got to move on it really quickly and hard. I'm prepared to take whatever decisions I need to take to move this forward, because there's too many people in that chain, too many young people who are suffering at the moment, and staff who are suffering.
Yeah. And one of the things that I just find puzzling, I find it deeply puzzling how anyone could be a cricket lover and a racist. You only have to love the game and look around the world and think, it is obvious skills are sort of shared and distributed fairly, as it were, or possibly unfairly. But one of the things that we've heard this morning that I found most odd from a sporting point of view, from the point of view of a sporting club who in the end get measured by sporting success, was to say, pick a few of those Asian players, but not too many of them. Surely you pick your best players. And I mean, is that a fair representation of what went on at Yorkshire in the past? And B, did you know about that when you became chairman?
I'm embarrassed. I didn't know that. I've never heard that. I wasn't there during any of that period. And that is really for those there to answer at the time. I just can't assist with that. I personally have never seen or heard anyone say that in my short tenure. So. But
I mean, all the stats we've been quoting all morning, you look at it and you think, whatever.
Goodness gracious,
you have got all these Asian heritage players in Yorkshire, all very, very good up to the age of 16. None of them, literally none of them, in the Yorkshire team.
I totally agree. I'm obviously a cricket lover. I'm at heart a cricket fan, and when you drive through the streets of Leeds and Bradford, actually what you see in the parks is mostly people from a South Asian background playing cricket, and that they don't end up in the cricket club being stars for Yorkshire County Cricket Club is ridiculous.
And I'm fascinated. Around the boardroom, has nobody ever said, we could do better?
Yes, absolutely. In the short time that I've been there is an equality, diversity, and inclusion committee for this. There were a number of initiatives that were put forward to improve this, and actually the club recruited an equality, diversity and inclusion manager in March of the year. So there were positive steps being taken. So everyone understood that this is what the club needed to change, and it needed to develop and improve its accessibility and its reach. And actually, probably most importantly, that the South Asian community wanted to be at Yorkshire and felt at home at Yorkshire, which is clearly, so sadly, what we hear from Azim today is that he doesn't want his children even to play cricket.
Yeah, that's I agree.
That's the terrible punchline.
And if that's reflected more widely, then that's tragic on all sorts of levels. A final question to Lord Patel is one of the bits of culture that you think you need to change, that senior players, sort of England players, you know, the big names in the dressing room, they mustn't be allowed to set the culture, because that's one of the ways we've heard this morning it can get toxic. Do you draw that lesson from what we've heard?
I think they need to be. They're not just players. They're part of the solution. They're a key part of the solution. They need to be on that journey with us. They need to learn with us. You know, and Azim said in his own words, you know, you get in there 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, you grow, you watch your heroes, and you emulate what they're doing. And I think they need to come round the table now. So it's not just about the captain or the 2 senior players. It's about all the players having a say. You know, we talk about, in my world, in the health service, talking about service users and patients. Do we really do it? Is it, you know, do we consult? Do we talk to them? Or do we actually listen and work with them? And, you know, I'm a social worker, so that's what I bring. You know, I want to take those skills and say, be honest and truthful. Did it work? And I think that, you know, the question you made earlier about women, it's terrible. I can't believe I've sat in cricket clubs all around the place. You wouldn't let anybody talk about your mother or your sister like that. But it's acceptable. It's been done for years. I think we just have, you know, there is an education and awareness process. I struggle with the idea that a 2-day education course that you're forced to go on is going to change anything. I struggle with the idea, and I've been there and done it, of employing an equality manager, because it's his or her problem. It shouldn't sit in HR, it shouldn't sit there. It should sit with the chair and the chief exec. And if we don't lead it and believe in it, then you're going to hide into nothing.
Thank you. Alex Davis-Jones.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both our witnesses this afternoon. Roger, were you aware of issues with racism at the club before you took the post?
No, not at all.
No, it'd never been.
Oh. Well, I suppose I've read the press. I wasn't aware of specific allegations of racism, but I knew that the club had a history where the question kept being asked, because I'm a fan of the club, so I wasn't blind to questions that had been raised in the press in the past.
And when you took the post, being aware of wider issues in the club, was it something that you made a priority in terms of looking at to tackle?
To be candid with you, my first desire was to improve the culture at the club more broadly, rather than being in relation to discrimination specifically.
Okay. And how did you go about that?
Well, it's simply trying to engage with the senior executive and begin to understand them and how the club may change. Actually, I literally had probably only been involved in 2 Zoom meetings, 3 Zoom meetings from my date of appointment till when the Azim press statement was made.
Right.
And so when the Azim press statement was brought to my attention, which was late August, I spoke to one of the non-executives and we saw it as a brilliant opportunity.
Okay. How far does sporting success drown out disquiet about individuals at Yorkshire Cricket Club?
Well, certainly in my tenure, sadly, and in the last 5 or 6 years, Yorkshire hasn't had much sporting success. So I don't think it has drowned it out in reality. And as I tried to answer a question earlier, actually, the more South Asian players you can get into the side, the more talent you're introducing, the more successful you're likely to be. So I don't think, you know, the reality is, I don't think sporting success impacts the club's attitude to racism. If it did, it should only encourage it to be more engaging and accessible.
And we've heard about some of the ways in which disciplinary action was taken at the club or not taken because of other issues. But do senior players or the star players get leeway or preferential treatment when it comes to any allegations made towards them or any issues in their behaviour? Are they treated differently?
I've not witnessed or seen that, so I can't help with that question. I'm sorry.
Okay. Is it more difficult then to discipline senior players because of the high profile that they receive in the media and with fans?
I wouldn't say so.
Okay.
In my experience at Yorkshire, I wouldn't say so.
Okay. If I bring you now to the report into the inquiry, which we've discussed already today,
Yes.
Did the findings of the inquiry surprise you?
Yes.
And what was your first reaction on seeing that senior players were involved in this discriminatory behaviour?
I was shocked. I was shocked and surprised.
Did you think that publishing just a summary of the report would satisfy those interested in what was actually happening at the club?
I recognised that were limitations in only publishing the summary of that report.
Okay. And in recognising those limitations, with the hindsight you've got now, what would you have done differently?
On the subject of publication, it's a very important question, which is you're right to bring. There are a number of complexities you will have seen on the report itself. There's a very strong warning about the confidentiality of that report, and that without the participants, many of whom are employees of the club, agreeing to waive those rights, you can't publish. After the investigation was started, there was then subsequently brought an employment tribunal in December 2020, which also complicated the issue, and the strong advice from the barristers at that stage was again that you could not publish that report. So sadly we could not, under legal advice, publish the contents of the report in the way that we might have liked.
I'd like to ask you now about some of the most harrowing testimony we heard this morning from Mr. Rafiq around the way he was treated following the loss of his son. Are you aware of a bereavement leave policy or a personal circumstances support at the club for players and staff?
I believe there is a policy, yes.
There is a policy in place, and you're aware of what that is? And
not as detailed, I'm not, no.
Right, okay. And are players supported with mental health? We heard some of the testimony around some of the Muslim players at the club, how they were treated when they were fasting. Is that taken into account, and does the club have a policy to support that?
There are mental health policies. I'm aware of one player having had support over the period when I was a chairman. I'm not aware in more detail of anybody else than the one player I know having had support.
Okay. And what was the feedback of that, if you've received any?
I haven't received it.
Okay. Lord Patel, probably a question for you now. A number of players, since Mr. Rafiq has spoken out, have also come forward with their own experiences of racism at the club. Do you have plans to reach out to these players and speak to them about what they too have experienced, and what steps are there in place to support current and former players at the club?
So I think my initial process has been to set up a completely independent, we call it a hotline, but it's a place where people can go with confidence that the issue will be looked at very carefully, triaged and then taken forward, and I think that's really important. That I think the whole process has encouraged people to come forward. If I would rather that than, forgive me, to go to the media, where it's trial by media as opposed to a proper process in place. I've reached out to lots of people who've sent me a message where I think it's appropriate for me as chair to talk to them. Now we've got the hotline set up within literally days. I think it's more appropriate that it goes through a process. It's seen to be going through a process. It's not Yorkshire dealing with it, it's independence. And we take that challenge and then take it forward.
Are you aware of how many calls you've had to the hotline since it's been set up?
Literally, I think it's gone live today, so I literally don't know. I mean, in 3 or 4 days we've talked to the more senior barrister who's leading this. We've set up the structures for it. We've asked him to write the terms of reference. We're not dictating, and I would imagine there's going to be a number of calls. And look, people may still feel, Yorkshire set this up. I can't do this. I want to have a phone call and have a discussion. We will do everything possible to enable those discussions to be had, even if it means me personally going out. But I want to try and keep it independent. I've got a role, and I think things have to be investigated properly.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask you, Mr. Hutton, were you surprised in any way in the way that the report into the inquiry was written?
I've no experience of receiving a report like this before. I didn't actually know what I was likely to receive. I ultimately was surprised that there was, as it were, differing views from the investigation team, the international law firm, and the conclusions of the panel, which to some extent was unhelpful.
So it was couched in terms that were so defamatory it couldn't be published. Was that helpful to Yorkshire Cricket Club?
No, it was very unhelpful to Yorkshire Cricket Club because the investigation team had, by and large, I think, tried to write a report that anonymised the issue so far as they were able. The panel conclusions were much more explicit, and therefore it made it more complicated to publish.
But do you not think, well, maybe this is something with hindsight, but do you not think that if it had been possible to produce a report that could have been published, that it would have helped the situation, we wouldn't be where we are now?
Yes, I definitely agree that it would be more helpful. There are a number of problems with Yorkshire County Cricket Club handling this report, and one of them is because it's essentially dealing with its own employees in the situation. So there's a general defamation point, but actually there's a different point that a number of your employees have volunteered to participate into this investigation and have rights associated with that. And unless they waive their rights, then you're in a situation where you can't, as an employer, you can't, it's much harder to publish.
So, you mentioned employees being involved in the inquiry. Did it alarm you that so many people refused to give evidence to the inquiry?
Yes, I don't know how many did refuse, but because I have no visibility on the investigation process, I've not seen the evidence other than a Zoom statement, and I don't know exactly who didn't. I know certain people clearly didn't, but I don't know how many others didn't come forward. I mean, people did come forward. Tino Best and many others did come forward. But yes, one of the difficulties with the club commissioning the report is that we can't compel anyone to come forward because it's a voluntary process.
I mean, are you satisfied with the inquiry? I mean, do you think it lifted up the rocks or just said there's a rock over there?
Am I satisfied with that? I'm glad we did it. I think actually it has shone the sunlight on Yorkshire County Cricket Club's culture. I don't agree with all its findings, and the process was to some extent flawed, but I'm still glad that we carried out the investigation.
Yeah, so what's your association before you became chair of Yorkshire Cricket Club? Are you a long-term fan?
Long-term fan from when I was 7 years old, yeah. I was a long-term fan. I hadn't served on the board before I came straight in from not being a board member to being chair.
So what does the Fletcher report mean to you?
It doesn't.
It doesn't?
No.
It was a report to Yorkshire Cricket Club in 2014 into racism in the club. It had quite significant findings. Not a reference point for you when you became chair.
I wasn't aware of it.
Can I ask you, Mr. Patel, what do you know of the Fletcher report?
Well, I know it's a fairly stark, damning report, and there's lots of issues in there that clearly haven't been addressed over the years. And I think we'll be going back over lots of reports that present various bits of evidence. My personal position is we need to take stock, we need to listen, we need to go on a journey, and it's very difficult. And how can I relate it? I mean, if my wife was born under apartheid in South Africa. People, I have relatives there. My mum was born there. We have, the day Mandela took over, you could have had a bloodbath, and people would have said, that's justice. The fact that some people could sit round the table with somebody who bullwhipped them the day before and work a way forward takes humanity to a different level. I mean, could I do that? I don't know. But I know that I need to take people with me, and people need to learn for themselves. I mean, it's pointless me going in there as chair saying, if you don't do this and you believe this, then you're out the door. Or people say, no, we do, and they don't own it. Ownership is crucial, and the journey is crucial. And, Azim said in his own testament, I don't think half the time it was water for ducks back, because that was what happens every day. And, you and I and everybody here knows that happens every day in lots of environments, and we as a society have put up with it too long. It pains me that this is prevalent in cricket, and it really does. I mean, cricket gave me an escape in life that was tough. I wish other children could have that opportunity as well. And it's up to us, and it's I play my part in that to look at all the history, look at all the reports, but actually now work out a very practical, action-orientated way forward. And that's going to be tough. But as Azima said, with politicians being involved, and you represent people, and and that's it's not about MPs, it's about your constituents have said we're not having this, and I think we have to follow suit to do that. Sorry, long-winded answer to your question.
Thank you for your answer. But Mr. Hutton, but just shortly after you became chair, the murder of George Floyd occurred, and we had the Black Lives Matter movement. What was the response of Yorkshire Cricket Club to what was happening through sport in response to that?
There was no immediate response to that. The reality was that the players debated amongst themselves what stance they should take in relation to that, and wore a logo, I believe, on their shirts at the time. The real response, I think, the opportunity was when Azim, really only half a dozen weeks later than the George Floyd death, made his statement, and that was our opportunity to get to grips with the situation and develop change. That was the moment I saw the opportunity. So,
I mean, there was a lot going on in sport in response to Black Lives Matter, and it's not the Black Lives Matter the movement; it is the upsurge of, upswell of public opinion and concern. And would you say that Yorkshire Cricket Club was an outlier and didn't respond like other people, like other organisations?
I wouldn't say that publicly. No, I wouldn't have that view of what they did. In reality, no, I wouldn't say that.
So what was done? I mean, you allowed the players to have a discussion, but from board level down, was there anything that was instigated?
So there were three things going on. The players wore anti-discrimination logos. I can't remember what the wording was. You may have it. We had an EDI committee trying to create and develop change. We knew how important that engagement and diversity and equity was. We had an ongoing plan to develop that, and in essence, that was our reaction to the tragedy that happened in the United States.
Last question. Where do you think we would be now if this committee hadn't intervened and insisted on hearing evidence and calling for the report to be handed over?
I'm not very clear, actually. I mean, Lord Patel has made some great steps forward, and I'm thrilled at that. I do wonder whether, in fact, that the input of this committee has resulted in that being a situation that there was no reflection of Lord Patel is doing a great job, but whether or not he would have had the support and the ability to deliver what he started to deliver without your involvement. So I do worry if you hadn't got involved, what would have happened.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Could you, Mr. Hutton, shed any light on a question I asked Mr. Rafiq earlier on about when the report was originally commissioned? Its terms of reference were that those writing the report would basically have two things that they would do. The second of which would be to make a finding as to whether Yorkshire Cricket Club was institutionally racist. And that was the original term of reference in September 2020, I believe. And then whilst you were chair of the club in April, I believe, of this year, that was changed. And they were no longer to report to the panel on the issue of whether or not Yorkshire Cricket Club was institutionally racist. Can you shed any light on that?
Yes, I hope I can. That when the original scope was set out and agreed with those people representing Azim Rafiq, there were two issues that the investigation team were going to look at and the panel were going to report on. They were the specific many allegations from Azim, and secondly, the extent to which Yorkshire County Cricket Club was institutionally racist. And so the actual question posed never changed, unbeknown to me, and I don't know when or how or at what stage. The panel asked the investigation team not to make findings on the second question. Because
I can tell you when it was. I'm surprised you don't know. It was on the 16th of April,
okay.
2021, as it says in the report.
Okay, thank you. Well, they didn't do that with my knowledge, and the panel, I can only assume, because I had no input into the process at all, stateless, stood completely back from the process. The panel must have concluded that it wanted to make the finding on whether the club was institutionally racist rather than the investigation team.
Could you speculate at all? I mean, you were obviously, maybe it was appropriate, I don't know, that you weren't informed or touched about this change. I would have thought it would have been appropriate, but can you speculate at all as to why the panel suddenly, what are we, 7 or 8 months into the inquiry, suddenly decide that the terms of reference that they'd set, asking for the people conducting the investigation to make a judgment on whether the club is institutionally racist, is something they didn't want them to make because they wanted to have control over whether that conclusion was drawn. But why would they have done that?
I have no answer. I'm sorry, I do not know why they did that.
Do you? Lord Patel, obviously you weren't involved at this stage. Have you got any thoughts on that?
If I was chair of an organisation and I set an inquiry with clear terms of reference, which I would expect myself and the board to agree, if for some reason those terms of reference were changed halfway through, I would want an immediate board meeting to discuss why those terms of reference have been changed.
And in the inquiry you set up, I think you told the committee that in fact the terms of reference would be set by
the independent QC who's looking at this.
Sorry, Mr. Hutton.
That's what happened. So I took no part. So I set off the investigation team and the independent panel to answer 2 questions. One is about the allegations of Azim Rafiq, and the second is about whether Yorkshire was institutionally racist, which is a massive question.
But the panel, at some point, decided they didn't want the investigating team to answer the second.
They wanted to answer it themselves.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
they did.
Well, and
but I didn't know about that.
Well, and you didn't know that. Well, we all wonder why, don't we? Mr. Hutton, is Yorkshire Cricket Club institutionally racist?
Well, the report concluded there was insufficient evidence. The panel concluded that there was insufficient evidence. I have to observe that in the last few months there's been a substantial amount of thoughtlessness and ignorance, a reluctance to apologise, a reluctance to see Azim as the victim, and a reluctance to put into place the recommendations, which I think are really important in this process.
That sounds to me like you're edging towards the word yes in answer to my question. Would that be fair?
I think the question remains unanswered.
My question is to you rather than what happened in the report.
Okay. So
in your view, you were chair for 18 months,
yes.
and you've resigned.
I fear, yes. Sorry, I shouldn't speak across you. Yes, I fear that it falls within that definition.
Right. Thank you. And Lord Patel, how does it feel to be the chair of an organisation that's institutionally racist, according to its previous chair?
That's a very interesting question. And
that's why I asked
almost, yeah. I suppose that almost suggests, that organisations I've chaired in the past, or other people have chaired in the past, are not institutional racist, and there's an issue. I've been appointed because there's a charge of institutional racism, and clearly the processes, systems, the systemic nature of what's been going on, as we've witnessed in many organisations, feels to be there. My job is to work as hard as I can with people to change that process. I have to be proud of the organisation I'm chairing. There's no question about that.
Okay.
I have to lead it into the right direction.
Just to wrap this up a little bit, Mr. Hutton, has the ECB, who are also going to give evidence, done enough to combat racism?
No, for me, at the outset, when I spoke to the chair of the ECB on the 4th of September, I always felt that the ECB should be carrying out this investigation. I don't really want me to talk about that in answer to this particular question, but I think that the ECB should have carried out this investigation. I think the investigation would have been far better had they done that, for some obvious reasons. I think it was right that they should have done it. I mean, Yorkshire, this was a whistle-blowing claim against Yorkshire County Cricket Club extending from 2007 to 2018 against the executive of the club, and yet their response was to believe that Yorkshire should handle that when the claims were even against the executive in place at the time. And for me, that seemed wrong. It also seemed wrong to me because I believe and said at the time in that conversation that I thought this was a game-wide issue. And Yorkshire is a very prominent part of brand cricket, and I felt the ECB should have investigated at that time, and I believe they could have investigated at that time. Had they done, the questions that Yorkshire's struggling to answer this morning about independence would not have existed. The questions that I'm struggling to answer this morning about participation and getting people to participate wouldn't have existed. I think publication would also have been easier if the ECB had done that. So I think they should have recognised this was an issue they should have got involved in. I've heard they've said that they're a regulatory body. Azim didn't actually approach Yorkshire in relation to this issue. He made some public statements in the press. Actually, because probably, to be fair, and you've heard him well this morning, he had no confidence in Yorkshire at that stage. He thought it was institutionally racist. And in my view, that the ECB did have the discretion to start investigating at that stage. Actually, I think the regulations do allow them to do that, and any member of the ECB could have started the complaint, as indeed they've just done with Essex at the moment. So I think they could have investigated. I think they should have investigated, and I think the investigation would have been far more satisfactory if they'd done.
Thanks very much. Just finally, Lord Patel, you heard Mr. Rafiq's evidence earlier on. Do you know what White Rose values means, and do you have White Rose values?
I've been living in Yorkshire all my life. For me, it's about, I suppose, White Rose values is, straightforwardness, bluntness sometimes, being honest, transparent, having pride in being a Yorkshireman, and working with people. I mean, the old joke, if you come to London and say hello to somebody, it's an offence. It sort of sums up, that's what you'd expect.
Racism should be no part of that as well.
Racism shouldn't be a part of any values anywhere across the world.
Chair.
Right.
Thanks very much, Chairman. Hello, gentlemen. Thank you for your time. I don't want to detain you long. I just wanted to ask you, Mr. Hutton, so Premier League chairman, get together monthly, don't they? They have a monthly meeting. Presumably county club chairmen do the same, is that right?
Exactly right.
So Mr. Rafiq earlier, in answer to me, named a few other counties, didn't he? Leicestershire had been named a couple of times in his interesting evidence. I just wonder whether you would care to comment on the wider county game, whether Yorkshire has just been unlucky in being at the centre of this storm, could have been any one of the others. Whether your thoughts on that, please.
Well, I don't think if you've conducted acts of racism, you're unlucky. So I don't think Yorkshire...
Are you unlucky to get caught?
No, I think Azim was very brave, and it shone some sunlight on a massively important subject. But yes, it is, in answer to your question, it is quite clear from me speaking to other chairs generally that they believe this is a game-wide issue,
right,
and they believe it's an issue that should be dealt with on a game-wide basis.
Okay.
And I personally, in fact, I was invited to speak on the subject by Mr. Watmore at one meeting of those chairs, and I was quite vociferous in the fact that actually this is a game-wide issue and needs addressing by the ECB in one form or another.
You see, you could say Yorkshire are unlucky in having Mr. Rafiq to speak out. Actually, I think you're quite lucky, because I think it's giving you an opportunity to, as a club, to wipe the slate clean. The other clubs maybe, when we talked about it, didn't we, with him, maybe have players who are at the earlier stage of this journey, still thinking it's just bullying, maybe it's just them. I just wonder whether you would care to name any other conversations that you've had with chairmen where they feel that this is coming down the track for them next.
I don't think it's right for me, because I've only got anecdotal conversation from them, but there are a series of chairmen who I think want to work more proactively to deal with the situation, for the very reason that Lord Patel said, I've said, and this committee is here.
Just finally, are there any others that are on the edge? I mean, you walked away because you weren't happy, and I think I saw you on the news being followed by the vultures saying that you've resigned from the job you love. Are there any others that were on the brink, do you think?
I don't know that.
Right.
I don't know that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. And one final question from Charles Watling.
Yes, following on from Steve Brown, really, and I'm sure you'll agree that what we've heard this morning is an absolute travesty. A young man who had his dreams shattered by institutional racism, bullying and abuse. Are senior figures at the club aware of the unique position that they're now in to Phoenix-like do something about it? Now, the point I'm trying to make, and I think this really goes to you, Lord Patel, is that given that this has happened, given that it's been brought into the open, wouldn't it be wonderful if this could be a defining moment and bringing this racist, laddish, misogynistic behaviour finally to book, with the great club of Yorkshire leading the way?
I mean, I think you really articulated what I'm thinking. And this is, people use this glibly, this is a watershed moment. So for me, this is, the last two people I remember where I was involved in anything was Stephen Lawrence. He lost his life, and that was a watershed moment in terms of changing something. My direct involvement with David Rocky Bennett, who, died in a prone position with 6 nurses sitting on him until he died as a result of racism, and then my subsequent involvement in developing a strategy to help that. But they both died. This young man's, thankfully hasn't. He's, who couldn't be moved by what he said? Racist or non-racist, who could, if you're human, who could not be moved by that? There is, as Mr. Bryan has said, a moment in time where we can rise from the ashes if we want to do it that
Absolutely.
way. We can have a
I think what I'm
slate.
asking you, Lord Patel, is do you have plans
Absolutely
to make this
plans.
happen?
I want to make this the best county cricket club in the world, not just for cricket, but actually for having the right culture and having the right values going forward. And absolutely, I would like to be template that goes forward.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. That concludes our second panel. Lord Patel, Roger Hutton, thank you very much for your evidence today. We're going to take a very, very short adjournment, 2 minutes, I promise, while we set up our final panel. Order.
Ended. The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order. This is the Digital Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. It's our third panel today on racism in Yorkshire. We're joined by Tom Harrison, Chief Executive of the ECB, and by three other representatives from the ECB, Kate Miller, Mina Botros and Alan Dickinson. Thank you very much for joining us today, Tom, Kate, Mina and Alan. Tom, you heard what Mr Hutton said in terms of the ECB stepping away from this process. Why is it you let Yorkshire deal with this? They were clearly either incompetent or, frankly, they didn't want to deal with it in any sort of way. So why didn't you step up to the plate and deal with this?
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Can I just say, firstly, we've obviously sat and listened to Azim Rafiq's testimony this morning, and I think we've all been pretty moved by it, to say the least. I think it's brought forward a lot of emotions, and I'm sure that the panel share that. So I just wanted to commend Azim's bravery. And we have Alan here from the board, representative of the board, who will also just like to read a short statement, if that's all right.
No, it's not all right, I'm afraid. Okay. Mr Harrison, we've got limited time. Could you please answer the question?
Sure. Look, the reason why we didn't step into this investigation right at the start is because of the complex role that the ECB plays in relation to being national governing body, and we've sent the panel a sheet of that explaining that role. We are the national governing body, we are the promoter, we are also the regulator, and on regulatory matters it is normal practice for first-class counties to take on investigations that they want to take on at their will. It is then for the regulator, in other words the ECB, to sit in judgment of that investigation and, if need be, run an additional investigation on top. On this occasion, and I'll pass to Mr Botros, who is our Head of Legal and Integrity, was intensely involved in the negotiations at the time. Yorkshire were very clear that they wanted to run this investigation themselves. There was an offer put to the ECB about whether we wanted to partner.
So just to clarify there, So who was it at Yorkshire that said to the ECB that they wanted themselves to deal with this investigation? Can you name the names, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you.
It was the chair of Yorkshire, Mr. Hutton, who stated that he wanted the international law firm to carry out this investigation. And
so he's just lied to us? He's just lied to us, is that right?
The question that was put to the ECB was, would you would you want to put someone from the ECB on the panel that would come to the conclusions on the findings? And the ECB said that, given it's a Yorkshire investigation, it would not be appropriate to have an ECB person on the panel coming to the findings, because we have a role to play as a regulator and we will be carrying out our own investigation. And if Yorkshire will be carrying out that investigation first, then that needs to conclude.
So sorry, just to cut you. He did ask you to put someone on the panel of the investigation, but they were when they said that they wanted you to investigate, was he truthful or was he untruthful?
To my knowledge, Mr. Hutton asked us to put someone on the panel in relation to the investigation that Yorkshire were carrying out.
Yes, but the question is very simple. When he stated to this committee in the last session that he had asked you to take on the investigation, it's very different to whether or not you sit on a panel or not. What is the truth?
Sorry, it may be that Mr. Watmore had discussions as the chair at the time on that basis, but I can tell you that when it came to our regulatory department and in terms of the role that we were asked to play, it was very clearly, do we or do we not want to partner on the investigation with Yorkshire County Cricket Club? At that point, we took the very clear decision that we would not partner with Yorkshire. We would wait for them to carry out their investigation and then take steps post the investigation.
Because that was the interpretation. We'd had discussions over this matter ourselves, offline, so to speak, and that was what I was told by your organisation. So I'm a little bit perplexed precisely where partnering actually means taking on the investigation. What I'd like you to do, please, is I would like to supply to this committee all correspondence in relation to that decision as to whether or not it would be Yorkshire whether or not it was Yorkshire who requested that they take the lead with this inquiry, that it was a Yorkshire inquiry, or whether or not actually it was them requesting just you to supply a panel member. Would you be able to do that?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Because I have to say, pretty extraordinary if that is the line which has been taken with us today, if that is proven to have not been true in that respect. So that's pretty extraordinary. So why is it different for Essex?
Again, I think we've all learned some very key lessons from this experience, and indeed the mishandling of this investigation. Reforming our governance process, reforming our regulatory process happen all the time, right? We're always trying to get better, and we're always trying to be more thorough and better at how we do.
So what you're saying then, Mr. Harrison, is effectively you decided that you would go by the rules when it comes to Yorkshire, but with Essex, because of some bad publicity, you basically wouldn't go by the rules. You'd short-circuit that, despite the fact that we know from the Fletcher report that Yorkshire's a long history of basically not involving other communities and, frankly, racism.
No, I don't think that is a fair characterisation of the
What
situation.
is a fair characterisation, and why Essex and not Yorkshire?
Mina, would you like to just explain it from your perspective?
Yes, thank you. So in relation to Essex, we started our regulatory investigation at a time when Essex were not conducting an investigation, so there was no investigation to wait for. With Yorkshire, as we just set out, there was a desire from Yorkshire to carry out this investigation led by the international law firm, as you're aware, and we were told that would be...
Are they a law to themselves, effectively Yorkshire, in the regulatory system? Because it seems to be as if, frankly, that they had a free pass on this until they've screwed up. Whereas Essex, because they haven't launched the investigation, because basically they were in communication with you throughout the entire process, as I well know, they then basically you come in and you circumnavigate it, you short-circuit it and carry out your role as a regulator. It seems to me as if Yorkshire almost too big to be pulled up about things like this. Is that fair?
If I may, in relation to Yorkshire, what happened was we were told that they wished to investigate this. They were going to commission an independent international law firm to carry this out, that it would be completed within 3 months. That
a law firm that Mr. Hutton used to work for?
Yes, and that the findings would be published, and that they committed to carrying out the recommendations from that. So based on those commitments from Yorkshire...
Neither of which they did.
Correct, and, and the unacceptable way that it has been handled is a big problem here. But in September 2020, when we were given those commitments, we therefore stated that we will not start our regulatory investigation until that period had concluded and they had come to the findings. But we were clear that we would then be conducting our investigation regardless of that. With Essex, when I became aware of the allegations that have been made, we then immediately started our regulatory process. There was no correspondence with Essex.
Will you do this every time in the future? Because this, I mean, it's just extraordinary that Yorkshire were allowed to effectively construct a report which was never meant for the light of day because it was so messed up. And I actually argue probably deliberately so. And then effectively that means that they almost could get away with, frankly, burying Mr. Rafiq's quite telling, pertinent and quite obviously true evidence in many instances. Yeah. Why is it that the game allows a club, no matter how big, to effectively behave in that fashion? Your role as a regulator, surely from this moment onwards, should be ensure that no club ever again performs in the way in which Yorkshire has performed over this.
Well, I completely agree with that sentiment, Chair, and I would just add the following, that the reason why Yorkshire were allowed to undergo this investigation is because up to that point it was fairly normal practice for first-class counties to run their own regulatory process, and then for ECB as the regulator of the entire game to effectively sit in judgment of that investigation done internally. We have learnt lessons through this process, and the thing obviously that is incredibly hurtful is not only the fact that it has been handled so badly, but indeed the fact that it's taken so long for the investigation to be published, indeed sent to the ECB even, which took months for us to get copies of it. So we've got a litany of issues to deal with that will help inform our regulatory processes going forward.
Okay. David Green?
Just one point about the overall process, and thank you for the helpful document. The ECB's basic role is to promote the game, including the county game. One of its other roles is to regulate the game. In a situation like this, where you have an inquiry that basically is trying to hide, as it were, not to look under the stones enough, isn't there an inherent conflict of interest in that? Shouldn't the regulatory function be in a different body than the promotional function? Because it's perfectly clear that in instances like this, they conflict. It's more difficult to sell cricket now than it was a couple of months ago because of this.
And you rightly point out that there is a complex role there, both playing national governing body, promoter, as well as regulator. I think it brings some significant advantages to us as a sport as well, to have everything under one roof. Indeed, and that includes dealing with government and operating as a single sport, singing with one voice. And we do have processes which keep the independence of the regulatory operation in place. But Mina, perhaps you can give a little bit more perspective on that, given how it works.
Absolutely. You're right that there is that conflict, or at least potential conflict, depending on the circumstances, and the ECB recognises that, and the ECB's put in place structures to deal with that issue. So in relation to regulatory matters, there is a regulatory committee which is chaired by an independent chair and independent individuals on there with relevant experience, and they oversee regulatory process, including cases such as this and the prosecution of cases, so that there is that separation between the regulatory arm and the promoter, as you state, and they hold the ECB to account in carrying out that role.
Sorry, who holds the ECB to account?
The Independent Regulatory Committee.
Who appoints the Independent Regulatory Committee?
The ECB. They are chaired by an independent individual, and they have independents on there who make decisions in relation to cases.
Yeah, I would make the fair observation at the moment that maybe Parliament isn't the institution best equipped to advise people on how to regulate themselves. But nevertheless, I can only suggest you have a look at that. I mean, an independent panel that you appoint that then holds you to account seems a bit circular, to put it as politely as I can. I think that this might be a structural weakness in the process.
I think we discovered quite a few today. Julia.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like the Wild West, this, to me, to be honest. I mean, do you think that's appropriate that you appoint the committee who actually is supposed to be independent of you?
We rely on the independence of those individuals.
No, do you think it's appropriate?
That is the structure we have in place in order for the...
Do you think that's an appropriate system?
I believe that it works and that the ECB is carrying out that role.
So you've got no idea whether it's appropriate. Do you think it's an appropriate system?
Well, I think in the absence of a better system, it works. And look, if you look at the personnel on our independent regulatory committee,
that is not really the issue.
Right.
To me, it does not sound like an appropriate system. In fact, it sounds like an absolute system that is open to abuse. But you cannot answer the question. It's appalling. So you said earlier that you knew that Mr. Hutton used to work for this independent international law firm that was doing the inquiry into what was going on in Yorkshire. Did you know that before the investigation started or afterwards?
So we were informed in early September that Mr. Hutton would be using that law firm. I wasn't aware of that before it came to light. I don't recall at which point exactly I was aware of that, but it was Yorkshire who were going to be appointing that firm.
So at the point that you became aware of it, did you at any point question that might not be an appropriate company to do that?
We were conscious of our role in that we were going to be carrying out a regulatory process in relation to this, both in terms of the allegations but also Yorkshire's handling of the matter, and therefore it was not appropriate for us to input into how they carried out that investigation. So we didn't want to therefore tell them who to have on their panels, for example.
No, but it's not about telling them who to have on the panel. It's about saying to them, as a critical friend, I would suggest that it would not look right having a company that the person, Mr. Hutton, used to work for, running this inquiry. At no point did you think that was a sensible thing to put forward.
I agree with the point you're making. It's not, as you put it, a good look. However, we've got to be conscious that we can't take small steps in intervening in that process because we have to respect.
It wouldn't be intervening, would it? It would just be simply saying this would not look good. Mr. Harrison, did you not think of suggesting that?
Well, as I said, the ECB has to be independent of the. If we're going to be overlooking and sitting in judgment of a process, and we are prepared to make an intervention into one part of the process but not another, but I don't think that is an independent regulator.
It's not really an intervention. It's a passing comment. Have you actually, to say to somebody, have you thought about how this looks? That isn't really intervening.
Well, I can't confirm that there weren't offline comments made to that. I certainly didn't raise it. It is, as Chief Executive, did not raise it. The regulatory function needs to sit outside the operational function for obvious reasons, and some of those have been raised already. But we need to make sure that when we are able to sit in judgment of an investigation, it is having been independent all the way through the process.
So you said, I can't remember which one of you said, but one of you said that that it was normal practice, I think it was you, Mr. Harrison, actually, that clubs carry out their own investigations. And yet, it wasn't normal practice for Essex to carry out their own investigation.
No, that's... Lena, do you want to explain that?
My understanding is that Essex will be carrying out an investigation now. My point was that at the time we started our regulatory investigation, and this was prior to it coming into the public domain last week, prior to the resignation that was covered last week in the media, there wasn't an Essex investigation. So the standard practice is that if there is one, we will wait for that to conclude. If there isn't one, then we will commence straight away.
So at the very least, as an outsider, and I'm not a cricket person, but looking at this, it's very cloudy. And as I say, you could describe this as the Wild West, the way this is what we've heard this morning. Do you think the ECB is fit for purpose?
Yes, I do. I think we are learning a lesson here about...
And what lesson are you learning, Mr. Harrison?
Well, I think we've got a long way to go to fulfil our ambition to make cricket a game for everyone. That is something that ever since I have done this job, I've tried to ensure that the game is providing opportunities to more people from more different backgrounds to come and take part in this game.
And you get funding from the EHRC to address equalities issues. How are you using that money? What are you actually doing to address those issues?
Kate, can I pass to you to take on some of this?
Yeah, we receive funding from many bodies, Sport England being one of them as well, to drive diversity initiatives across the game. There's quite a lot that we've initiated. The ICEC, the Independent Commission for Equity in Sport, is something equity in cricket, was conceived in November 2020 and launched in March 2021. Their remit is to explore issues around race, gender and class within cricket at the moment. Cindy Butts, who I'm sure is known to many of the committee, is the chair of the ICEC. So that is one of the initiatives. The Anti-Discrimination Code, which we launched at the beginning of this season, has rolled out across the game, and it means that everyone that sits within the ECB's jurisdiction is now holding to new standards around anti-discrimination. We had elements...
And how are you holding people to account on that as to whether people are actually doing this?
If I can, Alan, if you could pick up around some of the ways that we hold our stakeholders to account. There are many ways. There's our regulatory process.
You're not here in order basically to pass questions around to one another. You answer the question or the chief executive answers the question.
Sure.
So if you're not capable of answering that side of the question, the chief executive can answer.
Yeah. So that stakeholders are held to account either through our regulatory process, and that can include fines, bans if you're players or those involved.
And have you done any of those things?
Yes, we have. So very recently we've taken the steps. So as soon as we were aware of the decision and we'd been informed of the decision about Yorkshire on the late October, we had an instantaneous board meeting to decide what sanctions we would bring to bear against Yorkshire, having apologised to Azim for the extensive racist behaviour he'd been subject to whilst a player at Yorkshire. The subsequent decision not to discipline internally led to us taking immediate steps to sanction Yorkshire County Cricket Club with the full kind of weight of what we have at our disposal, and that is, first of all, we provide funding to all first-class counties. But we also provide matches, and test match and international match allocations is one of the major revenue streams for first-class counties. So we have immediately taken steps to suspend Yorkshire from being a host of international cricket.
But that hasn't come about through your processes, has it?
Yeah, well, it
hasn't come to light through the processes that you've instigated.
So those are processes. We have lots of processes. There is a major match allocation process. There is then a stage...
What Ms Miller was talking about, engagement with stakeholders, the other things she mentioned, what has come to light hasn't come through anything you were doing. I accept you've taken action as a result of what's come out.
I think we've taken actions before that as well. Right. I think through the process of... So we were talking a little earlier about the impacts of the Black Lives Matter movement across cricket, and we, as a result of that, did our own exercise within the ECB, which I led personally, to hear the experiences of predominantly black British cricketers through over the course of cricket careers, dating back sometimes to the 90s, and to ask them what that led to the instigation and the launch of, in November 2020, we launched there would be an independent commission for equity in cricket. That subsequently launched in March this year, and we've talked a little bit about that. We have got the independent board, which has been in place since 2018. Since we put that in place, it's a fully independent board overseeing all of cricket in this country, and that is going some way beyond the Sport England Governance Code. We've revised and revamped our Anti-Discrimination Code, which we put into, which now covers all players and administrators through the game of cricket in this country. We've got diversity standards being applied through the game. We've got an all-game meeting later this week, where we will be launching...
Can I just ask you, you've listed a whole things then, but I come back to how do you know these things are being adhered to?
Right.
Because that seems to be where the breakdown here is from what you're doing as an organisation.
And actually, I do feel that the ECB have been aware of the importance of this agenda, not just racism. I think the whole point of discrimination, equity, diversity and inclusion has been if you look at our strategy document, Inspiring Generations, it has EDI at its heart, understanding and acting against discrimination at its heart. What we have struggled with is getting our first-class game to wake up to the same extent, and that is the point. That is, we are at that stage now where I think we are, if not already in an emergency, then we are approaching one. And I think to reflect some of the really interesting comments that Azim has made this morning, it is very refreshing that even having been through the experiences he's been through, he is willing to help us, to work with us, to be a leader, to help us ensure that these reforms are taken through the game quickly, and it's action, not words, that follows.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. You asked the question as to whether ECB was fit for purpose, and I would strongly assert that it is. But can I just comment on some of the issues you've raised, please, if I may? We do have had a long-standing desire, which started very much from when Tom joined the ECB as Chief Executive, that we wanted to make the game a game for everyone. There's a lot of work involved, and a lot of initiatives have been taken. Part of the process that we have today is to set up what are called county partnership agreements with each of the first-class counties, by which we regularly assess, sit down with them as to whether they are making the appropriate strides towards good governance and good standards throughout their counties. And those are things where we can check on a regular basis how people are doing. Now, I have no doubt, and I can only apologise to Azim Rafiq and his family for the horrendous time he has gone through, not just when it happened, but subsequently as well. But I want to leave you in no doubt that the game is absolutely filled with the determination to resolve the issue of race in cricket.
Yes, the observation I would make to that is it's all very good apologising to Mr. Rafiq. We've had a lot of apologies to him. What about the thousands of Asian kids, basically, who enter the game and then chucked out the other side and they do not actually make it, or disproportionately? It's all very good talking about initiatives and EDIs and banding words around, but the point of the matter is there's 85% of kids at Bradford Park Nets of South Asian background, and yet we have 4 British-born Asians representing Yorkshire in the last decade. What on earth is going on? You can't just say, well, the game is doing this, the game is doing that, because clearly you're failing.
Well, I think we have to do better, but I do not believe that the evidence is all bad in that space. I think we have got...
It's actually got worse. The evidence has got worse in terms of participation.
Okay, we accept that there is an awful lot more work to do here, and I also believe that we've got signs in different parts of the country where there are really, really good elements of best practice happening here, and it's not fair to say that that is symptomatic of the entire country. We know that we've got
just in the biggest county with the most championships with the most England players, just the biggest mass participation sporting club, I believe, in the UK. That's just that one is the one that's the problem.
No, I'm not saying that. I think that and I'm not refuting any of the evidence, by the way. I'm suggesting that there's a lot more work to do, and that the policies that we have put in place, be that putting in place 1,200 female South Asian activators to help to get young females to play cricket in parts of the country where we previously haven't, urban cricket centres that we're opening up around the country in parts of the environment where we don't
typically
have...
We're going to move on to Clive Efford, then Kevin Brown. Clive Efford.
Thank you, and thank you for coming to give your evidence. You sent round a note to us saying combating racism and making cricket inclusive and accessible, which is very helpful. And you've set up an independent commission under Cindy Butts. That's the first point you make. What are you hoping to learn that we don't already know from that commission?
Well,
Yeah, I'm happy to take it. And we obviously want to know what is going on around the country, and we want evidence.
Why don't you know? For goodness sake, come on.
We will not know everything. We will not know the people who, like Azim, have perhaps felt unable to disclose what has been happening to them. So we have called, that the Commission has called for evidence, and it's called now, and I'm looking forward to seeing what the output of that Commission is. Now, you cannot simply say, we know what the answer is, and we will go and deal with it. That's part of it, but we must get evidence from around the country. We need to set up the whistleblowing lines that Lord Patel has set up, and get all the feedback we possibly can so that we know that we understand the full extent of the problem.
If I may, Mr. just to follow up on that, we know there is mistrust of administrators and organisations like ours. Tom did a lot of listening work after the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd's murder, and we know that people do struggle to come forward. What we did want to do is try and set up an independent body who could hold us to account, report back to us, and share independent findings that we can then share with the game. I think it's clear that we haven't gone far or fast enough. We do want to learn and listen to other people. And to Azim's earlier point, he requested that we listen. He requested that we did a good, strong listening exercise. And I'm pleased that the ICEC is there and that they can support us in doing that work. I think there is more for us to learn.
Okay, so what your second point in the note you've sent to us, it says you've introduced a game-wide anti-discrimination code. When did you introduce that code?
That was initiated at the start of this season, so we already had some anti-discrimination references within our code, and that hardened it and allowed all those that sit within our jurisdiction to fall under that rule. It allowed us effectively to have more powers and to be able to hold people account, prosecute. And what inspired you to, felt you, at that moment in time, you needed a new anti-discrimination code? Because presumably you weren't, you had one before that, because you would be falling down on your duties if you didn't have one. So why did you need to revise it? There were elements of anti-discrimination. There wasn't a hard, explicit anti-discrimination code. Previously, you would be charged with bringing the game into disrepute. From what we had heard, it felt necessary for us to be extremely explicit and initiate a fuller, harder anti-discrimination code.
Now, the Fletcher report that I referred to earlier on, which I interpret as an expose of racism in Yorkshire cricket, but others may take a different view, it clearly exposed the lack of opportunity for South Asian cricketers in Yorkshire cricket. What did the ECB do about that?
There's been a huge amount that we've done broadly. So our strategy, Inspiring Generations, we began to create that in 2014. That addresses many inclusion initiatives across the game from all underrepresented groups, not specifically just British South Asian audiences. We have a dedicated South Asian action plan that we're delivering against, and we're seeing positive numbers. We talked earlier on about, I agree with your thoughts around representation in England teams, but we've seen an increase of 7% to 28% of ethnicity in our boys' pathway, so that they are starting to work. We are starting to see data improvements there.
But doesn't the statistics show that you're more likely to represent England if you come from a public school than if you're from an ethnic minority background?
I think the data says that you're more likely to represent England if you go to public school in any sport, but I agree that it is an issue in cricket,
I
yes.
don't think that was held up in football, but never mind. So can I ask you as well, if I went and looked at the data, the Fletcher report was 2014, quite a detailed report. The previous chair wasn't aware of the Fletcher report, which was surprising. If I were to go and look at the statistics from 2014 to now, what difference would I find?
You would see, if I may, you would see huge work across our coaching base and improvement of underrepresented groups.
Yeah, you've said that, but where is the representation at senior level? Where is it? This is why we're here.
Yeah.
Because we are getting lots of participation. Azim said it himself. We're getting lots of participation at grassroots level. Lots of young people are playing cricket from the South Asian community. The issue we're here confronting is that they're not getting through to the elite at the higher levels of cricket in Yorkshire, as we're looking at today. But is that, from what we've heard, if we looked anywhere across the cricketing hierarchy, we would see the same. in other counties. So why haven't we seen that change?
Well, I think we're drilling into some of the real issues that have been brought around through Azim's testimony and the work that's been done through the report, and indeed will follow through the ECB investigation, which is happening now. But I think ultimately we need to start to look at dressing room culture through the country, and indeed the culture around the professional game specifically, and how we are looking at our pathways. As I said, we do have some positive evidence around some of the boys' pathway data that is following the imposition of both male and female talent managers at ECB, which we didn't previously have, which we now do. As I said, there is a huge focus on this, Mr. Efford, from the ECB. It does take time to trickle through the network, and I believe this is where we need help to enable our network to reflect the accountability that the ECB has and feels in this space, with the control to impose it.
My last question is, because others want to come in, and this is this term Kevin, the racist use of the name Kevin. And it has been alleged that is widespread, not just used in Yorkshire, but has at the elite level has been in common use. Has the ECB been made aware of the use of Kevin as a racist term at senior level, or any other racist incidents that have been reported to it that haven't been acted on?
Well, the first time I became of the slur was in the reading report. So it will now form part of the ECB investigation, and of course it will be dealt with in the same way that all allegations are being dealt with through that investigation. But I had not heard of that statement before I read the report.
What do you do if you find that England players are using this phrase?
Well,
no, you're the chief executive.
Well, we have but this is really important that we have a regulatory process which has with it a report which will go to the Cricket Discipline Commission.
You were fairly quick to ban Ollie Robinson.
Well, we were, and that's because we had to.
So someone, for example, using this particular phraseology because they don't wish to pronounce the proper names of individuals, and then, for example, jokingly has a black dog that they name after this. Well, what should happen to them? Are they someone basically you want in the England team?
No, of course not, Mr. Knight. And I would say this, that the difference between the allegation that you're alleging and the Ollie Robinson situation is one of them was wearing an England shirt at the time.
Yeah, he was also 14 or 15 years old when he made the particular comments, and this person is not.
18.
18,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
But Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Chair. The Cindy Butt Independent Commission on Equity in Cricket, will the ECB commit to introduce its findings when it reports?
In our CMC action plan, we have committed to listening, understanding and implementing recommendations that are made.
So you are committed to implement
Correct,
the recommendations that come out of that report. Thank you. Mr. Hutton earlier on, I asked him, has the ECB done enough to combat racism? He said no. And then he went on to talk about the fact that he wished that the ECB had conducted the report into Yorkshire Cricket Club. Was he wrong to say you haven't done enough on racism?
Well, until you've eradicated racism from the sport, I don't think anyone can say you've done enough. It's a scourge on sport, let alone cricket. It's a scourge on society, and we are taking the steps that we've set out today, whether that is around governance reform, whether it's about introducing the ICEC, whether it's about launching the Anti-Discrimination Code, whether it's sanctions against Yorkshire, or whether it's about now launching the EDI.
So your answer basically, you can never do enough to combat racism.
I agree. Yes, I think that is.
So can I just go back to the report itself and the process that was conducted at Yorkshire Cricket Club and the ECB's involved in that? Just to check, were you aware of what was going on around the change in the way that the terms of reference of that report was changed halfway through, so that the panel, was going to take it upon itself to report on institutional racism and not allow those investigators to make a determination on that? Were you aware of that?
I was not aware, no.
Would it be fair to say that effectively what you did here is you sanctioned a process by which Yorkshire Cricket Club were going to produce a report, which you were then going to overlook as the regulator? That's really what you...
Not overlook, take judgment on.
Take judgment as a regulator. And yet this was a process which Yorkshire Cricket Club were able to, and did in fact, for a long period of time, possibly until this committee intervened, withhold that report from your site. How can you sanction a process where someone's going to produce a report which you are then going to pass judgment on, when it's a process that allows them to actually withhold the report from your site?
As I think we've said before, we've learned lessons from this. I don't think there was anything wrong in allowing Yorkshire to do their report. It wasn't right for us to intervene in order that we could regulate.
But Mr Dickinson, you didn't say to them at the time, if you're going to do this, if you're going to do the report, you must show it to us. So we can do our job as the regulator.
The report to be completed within 3 months, and we expected to have sight of it thereafter. Clearly today, our process would not be to just let them do a report. We would do a report ourselves, an investigation ourselves as well.
You were sold a pup, basically, weren't you?
We trusted Yorkshire and we were let down.
Right. So that Yorkshire Cricket Club, not only have we found out today from their former chair, is institutionally racist, but it's also an untrustworthy organisation whose word can't be trusted. Is that what you're telling us?
I think the handling of the report, the handling of it, indicates there are some certain issues around institutional racism at Yorkshire. The handling of the report, I would agree with that.
What the content? Content, surely.
I think the content talks to culture, and the culture of the game, which is, needs to be thoroughly dealt with across more dressing rooms than just the Yorkshire County Cricket Club, as we've heard through testimony this afternoon.
Just to be clear, when Mr Hutton said earlier on, when he assented to the proposition that Yorkshire is an institutionally racist organisation, are you agreeing with that or not agreeing with that?
I'm saying that the handling of the
I heard you say that just now, but I'm not asking. I'm asking you whether you agree with what Mr Hutton said, when he agreed that he felt that Yorkshire was cricket. I think I asked him, is Yorkshire County Cricket Club institutionally racist, and he ultimately said yes. Do you agree with that?
I agree that the handling of the report indicates issues around institutional racism. That's as far as I'm prepared to go.
You're obviously not going to answer my question as to whether you agree with what Mr Hutton said. You either agree with him or you don't agree with him. And I understand what you said about the culture of it. You don't agree with him, do you? That it's
that's
what you're saying.
As I said, I think the handling of the report speaks to institutional racism.
I think any reasonable person would determine for that exchange that you don't fully agree with Mr Hutton. And would I be wrong to draw that conclusion?
I think I've made my position.
Okay. Yeah, just finally, Chair, because I don't want to go on forever, but Essex started an investigation now, is that correct?
That's
into the accusations. So do you abandon yours now or suspend yours in the meantime while they do theirs? And have you got a commitment from them that they'll actually show it to you when they finish their report?
We won't abandon ours. We welcome them also taking responsibility for looking into the matter, because they have responsibilities as an employer.
So there's going to be two competing reports produced?
Not competing. They are looking into it as an employer. It's a different role that they play, but we will carry out our role as regulator regardless of their investigation as an employer.
I see. So there is an obvious question. What if their conclusions disagree with your conclusions?
So that won't. So we will have two. There'll be two roles we will play. Well, there's two things we will be looking into: the allegations that have been made, and we will come to a judgment on that. But we also will look at the way they handle matters, and if they mishandle matters, that will be subject to a separate disciplinary process. So if they come to a different conclusion in a way that shows mishandling. So it's less about the conclusion and more about the way they handle the matter. So if they mishandle this matter, they will also be subject to a regulatory process, not just in relation to the allegations, but the way they dealt with them.
Okay, well, we can unpack that later. I think the Chair has to pull stumps soon, so I'll pass
Very well, no, we've got Alex Davis-Jones coming in as last man.
Thank you, Chair. I will be brief because I know we are short on time. Mr Harrison, do you see this as a watershed moment for the sport?
Absolutely, I do.
Then how do we make real change here and stop these initiatives that Mr Rafiq mentioned, such as the South Asian Action Plan, the Inspiring a Generation report, the plans to tackle misogyny, homophobia, racism? How do we stop this being tokenistic?
Well, I think it comes down to results and accountability, doesn't it? And Azim also spoke of that. I think the ECB would welcome the accountability to achieve the results that this committee and others expect us to do. We want to lead this, and there are times when we need to, through consultation and debate, consult with our game and then come back with answers. And there are times where, frankly, the ECB needs to lead and be able to have a degree of control. And that won't be a popular comment in the first-class network, but I believe in this case it is absolutely fundamental to our ability to remain relevant as a sport to our changing environment and to send a clear message about, first of all, is cricket a game for everyone? Are we serious when we make strategic comments that we fully believe in, about driving policy towards accessibility, towards openness, transparency, and all of the work that we have done through Inspiring Generations, which, although it's been maligned at certain points, it is an excellent strategic, visionary document that sets out what cricket should look like for communities in this country.
But it hasn't worked, has it? Because
we're in year 2 of 5, and all I'd say is that it is the right plan. It just clearly needs, and look, and again, I've heard the hope come through this committee today. I've heard it in every witness statement that we've heard this afternoon. I've heard an element of hope that we can use this to bring community leaders to help us, to bring people from different communities that have felt maligned, that have felt they can't speak, that have felt there's a lack of trust with the cricket authorities in this country. I think all of the measures that we've talked about today, such as, I know we keep going back to it, but the Commission for Equity in Cricket gives people an external venting opportunity. The hotlines that are going to be set up across the country. These are all opportunities for us to bring the game together and move forward.
You mentioned the hotlines, and in your own words, you've anticipated an explosion of complaints following the whistleblowing of Mr. Rafiq. Are you resourced enough? What actual resource and funding are you giving to this to make sure that you can cope with the explosion of complaints?
Right.
And how are these going to be dealt with?
Well, I think you can take it from me that this will be a properly resourced and properly funded element of our business.
Okay, whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes. Okay. And what we heard this morning from Azim Rafiq was that he wants this game to get better on the issue of racism. Rest assured, ECB absolutely shares that. We have a meeting on Friday with the whole game, and I personally am very sure that the whole game will want to come together to see action to get to where we need to be.
Okay. And finally, because I know we are short on time, but watching this today has been incredibly harrowing, being in the room, but I know there's thousands of people across the UK who've been watching this who love the game and want to support the game, but are being extremely disappointed by cricket and the game as it currently is. What do you say to that? And what do you say to people whose impression of cricket now is on the floor?
I say, please understand that we're really sorry for what the experiences that you may have been through trying to engage in cricket in this country. We know we've let you down, and we are going to fix this, and we're going to fix it quickly, and we're going to fix it fast, because the survival of our sport depends on it. And it's absolutely at the core of the ECB, and we will work endlessly to ensure that very quickly that message is received throughout our network, and we will transform this game very quickly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Finally. Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to come in because it's something I was going to ask earlier, but I thought I was running out of time. And it's on the sanction that you've taken out against Yorkshire Cricket and taken away the Test match. I wonder what sanction you've got open to you now, if you're in the light of your investigations. Now that you've done that, but is it the intention of the ECB to use the major cricketing events as leverage to make sure that county cricket clubs adhere to your anti-discrimination code and adopt whatever recommendations come out of your Commission's report?
Categorically, yes. Absolutely, we will. It's and just to explain your earlier point about what other opportunities we have to impose sanctions through the disciplinary and regulatory process. Mina, do you just want to cover that off quickly?
We do. So, as we've covered, we've got the regulatory role, and that is what we're doing with the investigation, and the sanctions for that will be delivered by an independent cricket discipline commission. But as well as that, as Mr. Harrison has set out, we're also the promoter, and there are sanctions that we can bring to bear through that. So the major matches that you have referred to, also funding through our county partnership agreement. So there are different ways in which ECB can bring sanctions to bear on the counties in relation to this area.
Thank you. Mr. Harrison, one final one from me. Colin Graves, the Graves Trust, and its relationship with Yorkshire. Many people outside the game don't quite understand exactly the way in which that they had Yorkshire at the palm of their hand, because basically they got the debt. And the trustees and their role in this debacle, and the fact that they, according to Mr. Hutton, they were a roadblock to reform of the board and changes at Yorkshire. What are you going to do about that trust and its relationship with Yorkshire? Because that appears to me to be desperately unhealthy for the game.
So one of the sanctions that we were asked to commission, that we handed down to Yorkshire a couple of weeks ago, was that the ECB's executive had been asked by the board, by the ECB board, to commission a governance review of Yorkshire County Cricket Club. So I think all of that will get caught up in that governance review, which we will make available to the